Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our virtual crafting activity and history lesson with the Tenement Museum. I'm Kat Lloyd. I'm the Director of Programs in the Tenement Museum's Education Department, and I'm really glad to be here with you this afternoon. Today, we're going to learn about how kids and parents worked from home in the early 1900s. This might be a subject that many of us are familiar with, and we'll look at the different types of work that New York's immigrants did from home and explore how people balanced their work and family in the same shared spaces. I'll also show you how to make a paper flower bouquet, a common item made in tenement apartments. It's a fun and simple craft that we can make at home. If you are tuning in live, please comment and ask us questions throughout the event. I look forward to hearing from you. Now, let me introduce you to the Tenement Museum. So at the Tenement Museum, we tell the stories of immigrants, migrants, and refugees in the United States. And we are a history museum located in the Lower East Side of New York City. This building is 97 Orchard Street. Many immigrants and their kids lived in this building in the past. Today, no one lives here, and it's home to the Tenement Museum. It's an apartment building, which that's really all a tenement means, is any building with more than 3 families. And 22 families lived in 97 Orchard Street at one time, each with their own apartment. There are 5 floors and 4 apartments on every floor. So if you count the windows across, that's how many apartments were on each floor. The building is in New York City in a neighborhood called the Lower East Side. Now, in the early 1900s, many Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe lived in the Lower East Side. There were many newly arrived immigrants, and it was important for them to find jobs and to make a living, just like it is for newly arrived immigrants today. So earned money was important because it was needed to pay rent, to buy groceries, house items. At 97 Orchard Street, there were many families who lived together, took care of each other, and earned money from working in their home. So while families were settling into a new life in a new space, sometimes an area of the apartment would be transformed to use for work. We're going to take a closer look at some photographs to talk about how immigrant families created a home and worked together while adjusting in a new place. So I want to introduce you to the Levine family, who were residents at 97 Orchard Street. We'll look closely at the home where they lived and worked. Now, here we see 2 black and white photographs. One of the photographs is an older couple. That's Harris and Jenny Levine, the mother and father in the family. They were Jewish immigrants who came from a place called Pointsk, Poland, which at that point, when they immigrated in 1890, was part of Russia. We see Jenny and Harris here. They are posed together outside their fits, and they are standing quite close to each other. The other photograph is their oldest child, Pauline, with her brother, Max. Max is seated and Pauline is standing behind him. Pauline and her siblings were all in the United States, and they lived with their parents at 97 Orchard Street in the year 1905. In 1905, Pauline was 12 years old and Max was 8 years old. So let's look at the apartment where they live. Now, if you tuned into our event last week, you met the Levine family and saw their apartment, and we talked about what kind of food they ate. Today, we want to take a closer look at what kind of work they were doing in their home. This room is one of 3 rooms in the Levines apartment at 97 Orchard Street, and this was their first home in the United States. Most of the other families that lived in the building when the Levines were here were also immigrants and newcomers to the neighborhood. So what we're looking at in front of us is the Levines parlor, or we might call it a living room. It was the largest room in the apartment. It has 2 windows that look out onto Orchard Street. And what we see here is that Harris has family set up as a small factory to make dresses. We see a pink dress directly in front of us and some pieces of fabric and lace on different surfaces, chairs and boxes around the room. We see a big kerosene lamp hanging in the center of the photograph from the ceiling, and light green patterned wallpaper on the walls, giving us a sense of how the family was making this space a home. Now, eventually, Jenny and Harris have 5 children. So by 1905, they are a family of 7: Pauline, Hyman, Max, Eva, and Faye. So 2 brothers, 3 sisters, and they're a family of 7 sharing the apartment space. So as you can imagine, the Levines had a lot of work to do in their new home, and everyone contributed in different ways. So both children and adults played a valuable role in helping to support the family, and when possible, earn money. Now, we see here Harris has a small factory in his family's home. He would have had very few options when it came to finding work. Maybe he could rent a push cart, which is a small table with wheels to sell different products. Could do something like rolling cigars, or like many of his neighbors, he could enter what was called the needle trade. This type of job meant that he was sewing clothing, referred to as the garment industry. Many people in the Lower East Side made a living sewing clothes, since big factory spaces were not common yet. And it was a job that people could do while keeping their language and religious practices. Harris and his family, they speak a language called Yiddish, and they would have practiced the Jewish religion, which would have meant that Saturday was an important day for them to not work and take a day of rest. So in many tenement buildings, families would transform an area of their home into a space where this type of work could take place. So often the space would have a sewing machine and room for people to lay out materials and fabric that they would have pieced together. So that's what we see in this space. Let's take another look. So here are 3 different photographs of the Levines' home factory space. So we see this pink dress on a model that they would use to give them the finishing touches on the dress. And Harris and his workers, there were 4 other people working for him as them. They would make dresses like this pink dress that you see in the photograph. And this room was really much more like a factory than a place to relax. So Harris, he would sit near the windows. We see in the bottom left, there is a table near the windows. That's where Harris would sit. And he would use a sewing machine to put together the different pieces of fabric for this dress. So here is Harris's sewing machine table. And you can see that the sewing machine, it looks old. And the Levines lived here in 97 Orchard Street before there was electricity in the building. So Harris had to make the sewing machine work with his foot. Some of you might be familiar with this kind of sewing machine. You have to move your foot up and down, up and down, up and down on a pedal to make each stitch. So we can imagine that would make a noise that would happen in this apartment nearly all day. From the time the sun came up to the time the sun went down, that sewing machine would be rhythmically moving with Harris's foot. And that's just one of the many sounds that we can imagine in this factory space. So Harris and his workers, they were paid to make dresses, and someone else sold the dresses to people who had more money. So the dresses might be sold in a department store like dresses might be today. So even though Harris and the workers worked every day late into the night, they didn't make a lot of money. And the one day they would take off was Saturday for the Jewish Sabbath. Remember, we said that the Levines were Jewish and that Saturday would be an important holiday for them to take a day of rest. So the factory space would be active 6 days of the week, every day except for Saturday. So let's see one photograph from the time period to give us a sense of what this home factory space would look like with people in it. Now, take a look closely at this photograph. This photograph shows 6 people working in a tenement apartment making clothes. It's a black and white photograph, so it doesn't have the color of the Levines apartment. And we see that there are 6 people seated and 1 is standing. They are all gathered near the windows. So the windows in these tenement apartments were really the only source of good light, which would help if you were trying to see small stitches and work on details on a garment. So this photograph, it's not of the Levine family and it's not of their apartment, but it's a similar time period and it can help us imagine what it was like for the family to work in their home. We can even see, you probably noticed, there's a dog resting its head on a chair in the corner of the photograph. So people had pets in the past, just like they do today. And we know by examining different documents that there are people outside of the Levine family who are not family members who came to work at the shop. Photograph, we don't know who the people are. Are they family or are they coworkers? So remember, at the time in 1905, the Lower East Side was a large immigrant community, and finding work right away would have been very important. Many people were looking for jobs and would be eager to find work close to home and with people that they were familiar with or had a relationship to. The workers, they may have been neighbors or friends of the Levines, and they most likely all spoke Yiddish, like Harris and Jenny did. They may have even sung songs or told stories to pass the time, because they're doing the same kind of work over and over and over multiple times a day. So they would need to entertain themselves. And I'm sure that while some of them became friends, that some of them also got into the fights. So we can start to imagine what it would be like to work in this space. And keep in mind that it's also the family's home. Now, when Harris and the workers made dresses to sell, they used fabric that was already cut. So they didn't have to cut any pieces of the dresses to sew together. But Harris never wanted to make their clothes for the family to wear, because it would have been less expensive and Harris knows how to sew. They would need to use a specific tool called a pattern tracer. So let's look at a pattern tracer now. So here we see a photograph of a tool called a pattern tracer. It sort of looks like a tiny, tiny pizza cutter. It has a small wheel about the size of a quarter with small dull spikes or teeth around the outside. It also has a black wooden handle. The pattern tracer would roll across the fabric to make marks, and then those marks would show Harris where to cut to make the different pieces of a garment. So we can look at this pattern tracer and think about who in the family might have used this besides Harris and Jenny. Maybe this was a job that Pauline, the oldest daughter, could help with, or even one of her younger siblings, if her parents are looking to make the family's clothes at home. So now we're going to look at a photograph of the Levine family, who's about different types of work that family members were doing. We know that all of the kids in a family would have a different role to play in working together to make their home, but what objects would help them with certain jobs? So we know everyone had to work hard to take care of the apartment. Let's go into the kitchen. Now, here we are looking at a photograph of the Levine's kitchen. You may have already noticed some of these details and some objects that you recognize in this kitchen. Can you identify what any of them may have been used for? Just looking around at the photograph and noticing what objects stand out to you. By looking at these objects in their home, we can begin to understand what the family's life was like with a factory space in their living room. Now, you might have noticed that there is what looks like a large sink and a piece of pink fabric draped over it. Behind that, it might be a stove with a huge pot on the stove. And behind the stove is a shelf, or we might call it a mantle. And on the mantle are what look to be pots and containers of different sizes. And there's a line with some socks and pieces of cloth hanging up. And we also see that there's a window in the kitchen directly into the living room space where the dresses would be made. And the final detail you may have noticed is that there is a crib in the kitchen. Now, this can start to give us an idea of what Jenny, what her experience is like. She's the mother in the family, watching the kids while Harris is working in the next room. And there is some things that might be different about this kitchen from the place where you live, and some things that might be the same. One big difference might be that there's no refrigerator in this kitchen. That means that anytime the family needed to eat something, they would have to cook it on this stove, and they would not be able to keep food for very long. Foods that are familiar to them, but Jenny might also learn how to cook new things. And we see these pots and different cooking utensils in the kitchen. Maybe the kids could help Jenny with something like whisking eggs before she cooked them to make for breakfast or lunch. So helping with cooking might be one activity that some of the younger kids might take on if people are doing other activities. Now, let's look closer at the bed in the kitchen. So here is the crib, and Jenny, she worked to take care of all of her kids, looking to keep the youngest ones as close to her as possible, meaning that this crib was right in the family's kitchen. And when her older children were able to go to school, they would leave the house, and that would leave Jenny to try to figure out how to take care of her younger kids. When the kids got back from school, they would probably be tasked with helping with chores and taking care of their brothers and sisters. So you can see on the crib is a baby bottle. It has a long tube and a glass bottle, and then a sort of pacifier end that would connect for the baby to drink the milk. And when Max was just 8 years old, his sister Faye was a baby, and so maybe he held her and gave her this baby bottle while his mom made lunch for the family and the workers. So this crib is a place where the babies in the family would be kept close to the others, and the people would take turns taking care of them and making sure they had what they needed. Now, another job the kids would help with is with the washing of clothes. So maybe some of you help with laundry today. Now, there is no running water in this thing. It's not connected to any pipes. And when anyone needed to drink, wash their hands, brush or clean something, they would have to use this washboard that we see in the basin to get out all of the the dirt from the clothing, and the water in this basin would be from the backyard of 97 Orchard Street. So they would have to go down the steps to the backyard, fill up a bucket, and bring it back up here. The Levines, they live on the 3rd floor, so there would be multiple trips up and down the stairs, and definitely the kids will be helping Jenny with that task. Now, after the washing, clothes would be hung up to dry. And since there are a lot of people living in this building, there might not be room to hang them all outside. So to make the clothing nice and ready to wear, Jenny would have to iron the clothes. And in this photograph, we see 2 irons in a long pan on top of the burners of the stove. We see another iron behind that. And these irons would be really hot and pretty heavy. They're made of iron. And the younger kids probably wouldn't be able to help with this task. So this is something that Pauline, the oldest, might be asked to do. So we see there are all these different chores within the home: washing clothes, ironing clothes, helping with cooking food, taking care of younger siblings. And each member of the family would have a particular role to make this space work. Now, the Levine family members, they most likely did not work in their family's home factory. So the factory was for Harris and his employees, and the kids and Jenny, they would be in the kitchen and bedroom throughout the day. However, there were other jobs in the neighborhood where all the members of one family might work together in their apartment on one particular task to earn the family's income. So we're going to look next at what some of those jobs might be that people could do from their home that the Levines are doing. So here, this is 2 pages of a pamphlet or document that was published in the year 1909, so just a little bit after the Levines are living in 97 Orchard Street. And this is titled Children Who Work in the Tenements. And on the front of this pamphlet, the image on the left, we see a photograph of a woman and 2 children sewing clothes. Below, it says, "No Saturday playtime for this 7-year-old schoolboy." The other page, with lots of writing, has a list of all the items that people, including kids, would work on from their apartments. It includes baby socks, buttons, postcards, taking shells off of nuts, and making artificial flowers. We can see that this document was made, in fact, to prevent this kind of work from happening. There were people in New York City who thought that children should not be working in their families' apartments. And there was an investigation to find all of where people were at young ages. Why would people not want children to be working? And why was it so common for kids to work for money anyway? So it was very difficult for many immigrant families to make enough money for rent, food, and their basic necessities. And many jobs didn't pay very much. So more than any other group in this time period, Jewish immigrant families' income would be contributed to by their working children. So this is true for older children and younger children. So teenage kids, they often went to work instead of attending school. This was because school was actually only required until you were 14 years old. So many families had to make the difficult decision to have teenagers work instead of go to school. But many younger kids, younger than 14, they could also work after they came home from school, and the money that they made would be essential to the household. So today, some of you might work for an allowance, doing chores around the house. And this is a little bit different because these children's income the making was all part of the family economy for paying rent and putting food on the table. Now, let's look at a couple more images of what people would make from home. So here is another photograph. We see 4 girls surrounded by fabric sewing. And it's hard to see exactly what they are sewing, but their hands are in a position that tells us that they are stitching. And they look to be holding the piece of fabric very carefully within their hands. Underneath the photograph, it says sisters aged 6 to 15 who earn together 35 cents a day, working after school until 9 p.m. or later. So from this photograph and this information, we know that these children, they're many different ages, as young as 6 and as old as 15, and that together they're earning 35 cents a day sewing these garments. And that they're working late until the evening. So think about, when, you go to bed or your children go to bed, and thinking about before dinner and after dinner to, make money for your household. So we don't know what this photograph really says about what the girls think about their work. Do they get bored? What are they talking about? So I like to think about what their conversations were while they're working. Are they friends as well as sisters? And what kinds of jokes and stories might they tell each other as they are doing their sewing? So when we examine these photographs of families working together at home, we see many young kids that appear to be an age where they should be attending school. So as we've talked about before, there are many kids, sometimes even younger than 10 years old, who are part of the workforce, whether that's in an apartment, a bigger factory, on a farm. Children who are working, this was often considered a benefit for their families. And they would work after they got back from a day at school. So in cities like New York, kids would work inside like we see here, but they would also sometimes work outside at push carts, selling products, or selling newspapers on street corners. Working inside the home did have an advantage in that caretakers, parents could keep an eye on their kids. who might be doing this work for money. And the kids could split their time between these types of work that are making them money and the household chores. So one popular item that people would make at home were paper flowers. So paper flowers were very common in 1905. You would see them for sale on the street and in stores, and often families would make them at home. So this photograph shows us a woman and two children. And the woman, she has a large, what looks like a suitcase in her hand. It's a big box and she's carrying it with a handle. Now, the two signs on the building, they say flowers. And this tells us that the business where the woman picked up materials is a business that makes paper flowers. So what the woman has done is gone with her children into this building to pick up this box, and she's going to take those materials home to her apartment and work with her family to make these flowers. So let's look at a photograph of people doing that kind of work. So in this photograph, we see a group of people sitting around a table making paper flowers. So how many people do you see in the photograph? We can count them. I see 7 people, and it looks like there are 2 adults, 5 kids, including a kid holding a baby. So maybe his job is to watch his younger siblings while the others work. And what details do you notice in this photograph? So that the whole table is full of paper flowers, and that they have some fabric draped over the table, maybe their table from the dust or scraps of paper that are left as they're doing this construction. Now, it makes me wonder if this is the same table where they eat their meals. I know these days we're probably using our kitchen tables for lots of different purposes. And this family is using their kitchen table to make these paper flowers using the same spaces for multiple uses. I also wonder how they keep themselves going. Maybe they're singing a song or, talking about their day. Perhaps one of the older siblings helps another with the tricky part of the process. We can see that there are flowers and then there's stems, and then they need to put them all together into bouquets. Now the family, each person would play a role, and they would have to work together to make enough flowers to get paid for their efforts. So often with many of these jobs, whether it was making paper flowers or attaching buttons to a garment, people would get paid based on how many of the item they were making. So in this case, they would get paid based on how many flowers they would make. A common number for counting products is called a gross, or 144. So for the work of making 144 flowers, a common price was 12 cents. So that wasn't much money, but you can see that with all of them working, they could make more flowers and perhaps make more money than just the adults working alone. So let's look at 2 more photographs of people making paper flowers before I show you how to make your own. So you got a sneak peek of this image a few moments ago, but here we see a young person sitting at a table by herself. She's wearing an apron over a long sleeve shirt and long skirt, and she has her hair up in a bun. She's holding a tool in her hand and using it to construct petals for paper roses. She has the petals on top of a small wooden block that she is steadying with her left hand while using the tool with her right. There are 3 stacks of petals in front of her and more tools hanging on the wall next to her. So this can give us an idea of the process of attaching these petals to each other and what people had to do to make these paper flowers. Now, in this next photograph, we see 2 women. They're sitting across from each other at a long table, and they are both wearing similar clothing to the previous woman, long sleeve shirts and long skirts. So you can see this is a popular style at the time. And they both have their hair back, right? You can see you'd want to keep your hair out of your face because you need to make sure that your sight is clear to do your work. And on the table, there are piles, many piles of paper flower bouquets, and they're working with their hands to construct more. Behind them, there's a string that looks like it connects from one wall to our paper flowers hanging on that string, lined up very, very close to each other so that they are touching. So perhaps those flowers are drying after being glued together. And it looks like the women might be very busy. They already have many flowers made, and they are working to make many more. So remember how we talked about, how many flowers people would need to get paid. They would need to most likely make about 144 flowers, and that an average pay for those flowers was 12 cents. So at the end of their workday, they might be asked to count how many flowers they constructed, and they would get paid based on that number. So now we're going to learn how to make a type of paper flower at home. We won't have to make 144 flowers, and this work will be easier than these girls' work. They would not have seen this work as arts and crafts in the way that we might see what we're about to do. But perhaps they were proud of their skill at making these delicate flowers. So here is the type of paper flower that we are going to make. So I will show you in a minute how to make it. I have made this one out of magazine pages. You can use any paper you have around that's thin. Newspaper, tissue paper is really good because it is different colors. And then for a stem, traditionally you can use a pipe cleaner, but I've used a wooden chopstick here. You could use a popsicle stick or whatever you might need. So let me show you the materials you'll need and the process, and then we will make flower together. So we want to gather our materials if you have them nearby. So we see here that you can use your tissue paper, wrapping paper, a newspaper, or magazine pages. I like picking ones that are really colorful because it makes the petals of the flower really pop. And to make the stem options, a straw, pipe cleaner, a popsicle stick. So you may also want scissors to add some different texture to your flowers and different shapes to the ends of your petal. Tape to attach the flower to the stem if you need to. Or string, which could help you hang them all together. So gather whatever materials you have, and this is the process that we will go through. I'll show you live in a moment. So we're going to need 3 pieces of paper. You can use a full magazine page, or you could cut it down to about a 7-inch by 4-inch square. Sorry, square rectangle. And you're going to stack those 3 pieces of paper, and then you're going to fold and flip them into an accordion shape, as you see in step 2. Then step 3, if you have a pipe cleaner, you will attach the stem, and if you have a chopstick or popsicle stick, you will need to tape the stem to your flower. Then you'll fan out the accordion ends, and you'll have your flower. So let's show you live how to do this. And if you have your materials, you can create along at home. So now I have my 3 pieces of paper. You see we have 1, 2, 3, and these are magazine pages. And what I'm going to do is just stack them all up so that they're lined evenly. And then I'm going to fold the top piece down, maybe about 1 inch. And I'm going to crease it, and then you flip it over. This is just like making a paper fan if you've ever done that. So I'm going to keep folding and flipping, making sure to crease as I go so that my folds will stay. And you just work your way down the piece of paper until you've folded the whole thing. So give it one more good crease to smooth it out. And then I'm going to use a paper clip to fasten my center of the flower if you need to. So in the center, just your center of your flower. Now next, I'm gonna fan out my flower first before I attach my stem, but you could do it the other way around. So you see I have my colorful pages here, blue and yellow. So I'm gonna fan these out and on the other side as well. And what I'm gonna actually do, because my magazine pages are delicate, is tape the edges of my flower together. So here you see I have a piece of tape, and you just turn your flower over to the bottom side, the side that you don't want showing, and just place a little piece of tape so that you secure the two halves together on one side. And then I'm going to take another piece of tape and do the same thing for the other side. So now turn it over again, and you see I have my flower. And this is where you can gently pull the layers apart. I recommend just touching the top layer and going where you have your creases and just pulling the layers apart very gently. This is going to be delicate, especially if you're working with magazine pages or newspaper. So just be very gentle. And if you rip it, that's okay. You can use scissors to make a design that covers any little injuries that the flower might have. So just fluff your flower pieces a little bit. You see, I've done that there. And then I'm going to attach my chopstick. So if you had a pipe cleaner, this is where you could just put your pipe cleaner in the middle and wrap it around. But here, I'm just putting my chopstick directly in the center where I have my paper clip, and then just putting another little piece of tape over the top. So you see here, the tape, mine's green, which is sort of the color of a flower stem. But if yours is clear, then your pages will shine through. But mine now has a green center. So this is just a simple way to make a paper flower. You see the stem and the top of the flower here, and that the different layers of the magazine pages show through when you kind of separate those layers apart. So now we're back, and here is the paper flower that we've just created. And you see it's a pretty wide one, right? So depending on what kind of paper you're using, your flower is going to look a little bit different. But that's okay. That's part of the spirit of using what you have around your home to make these kinds of crafts. And again, this would be very different from what the girls that we saw in those photographs would be making, because we weren't really following a lot of rules about material we had to use or regular colors. And we can make them as big as we want or as small as we want. But the girls in those photographs, they would have had to make their flowers to very specific standards. And they would probably have to make sure that none of the flowers got ripped or broken. Otherwise, they might not get paid for them. So I see we already have a question come in, which is fantastic, because we would love to hear what you were wondering about as you were making your flower and seeing the work that people were doing. So our first question is, who would buy these flowers? So that's a really important question, because every product that we see people were making in their homes, there are customers who are purchasing these. So these flowers might be sold on the street from carts and different push cart vendors. So you could buy these directly from walking outside of your home, or you could buy them in stores. There are actually stores that specifically sold different types of flower. And we can imagine maybe someone who lives a little bit uptown, maybe they're not an immigrant themselves, but they want a flower arrangement for their family's home, and maybe they're having a dinner party, and they want to have flowers as part of their celebration. So maybe they go out and buy a bouquet of paper flowers. So it's just a common way to have decoration in your home for people with more money. Most likely, the Levines and families who made these flowers are not going to be the ones who are buying the flowers because it might be too expensive for them to purchase. So we see another question, what types of materials would they be using? So the flowers, they might have been made from different materials. Paper would be a common one, but also fabric and different types of fabric, maybe silk or cotton. You would need fabric to be treated with a product to make it a little bit stiff, and that product might be a little bit of a thin layer of glue, other type of product that would make the fabric a little bit sturdier and more stiff, so that it could be crafted into petals like we saw the woman making. Now, a good question about how much materials would cost to purchase them. That is a really good question that I actually don't know the answer to. So I would recommend actually you can do a little research at home and try to find out how much people would have to spend to make these materials. But we do know that they would have to spend money because like any business, you have some startup costs and you would have to purchase the materials before you construct them into the flowers or whatever you might be making. So thank you for your questions, and we would love to hear any questions if you have them. It has been a real pleasure sharing this work with you, and seeing what families would have been doing to balance work and family in their apartment spaces. So again, we know this is really common to what a lot of us might be doing right now. And hopefully, the next time we get frustrated with one of our family members because they're using the same space that we need for something, we can think that we are part of a long history of people who are balancing work and family in their homes. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we will be hosting these events weekly, Wednesdays at 3:30. You can visit tenement.org/events for our series of events in the coming weeks. And please follow along on our social media for updates. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our newsletter to receive updates on these weekly events. So thank you so much again for joining us this afternoon, and we hope that you will join us again soon.